In this tutorial series, we're going to take a look at creating a collage animation like this.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Now there are a number of things that make a collage animation like this very distinct. One, of course, is the actual collage look itself. Of course, a collage is a composite of images sourced from various places. As you can see in this particular composition, it appears that the elements have been ripped from their original sources and then assembled here. This is an effect that we can achieve in Photoshop, which we will do shortly. But there are a couple of other things that make this type of collage animation distinct. One is a looping texture animation that we can then overlay over top of our other animation to give it a bit of grit. Another thing that makes this type of animation very distinct is the frame rate. This type of animation is meant to emulate a stop motion effect. If you've ever done stop motion, you know that it requires a series of distinct small movements that are then photographed in sequence. This creates a jittery look that is very distinct to this style of animation. As you can see here, as I scrub this animation, the elements from frame to frame have small movements, which you would expect to see if we were doing this as a real stop motion animation. Now, while I've completed this animation in After Effects, this whole project begins in Photoshop. I'm going to come over here to Photoshop. Now you can see here I have my countdown hands in a single JPEG file. This is the sequence that we're going to use in our exercise. What I'd like you to do is download this file and follow along as we create our textured collage imagery. Now, the first thing I want you to do, and this goes for any image that you download in order to use for this project, is to increase the image resolution. One of the things that we'll discover is that often we'll find resource imagery at low resolutions. We can do ourselves a lot of favors if we can just increase that resolution before we do anything else. You'll notice that if I zoom in, it doesn't take long before we can start to see just how pixelated the edges of these fingers are. Let's fix that by coming to the image drop-down menu and choosing image size. Now you can see here, while the resolution of this image is fairly high at 300, the actual pixel density of the image is not very high. The height is less than 400 pixels. Now Photoshop has really improved its Preserve Details algorithm 2.0, which makes this next step a great way of adding pixel density while maintaining clear details. I'm going to roughly triple the size of this image by increasing the width to 3000. Now this will work just fine for our animation. However, if we thought our imagery was going to be seen in close-up, then we might want to increase our pixel density even more. But for this exercise, these values will be sufficient. I'm going to say OK. If I take a look at my imagery now, I have to zoom in much closer before I see that edge pixelization. I'm going to zoom out completely by hitting Command 0. During this exercise, we are only going to affect one of these hands. I would like you to do all 5. I'm going to center the first of my hands in the center of my screen, and I'm going to make a selection by coming over to my toolbox and choosing my quick selection tool. Dragging over top of my hand like so, I can make a selection of that hand. I'm going to make a new layer out of that hand by coming to the layer drop-down menu and selecting New Layer via Cut, or Command-Shift-J on my keyboard. I now have a new layer in my Layers panel. I can turn off everything else just so I can see this a little bit better. Now we are going to make a number of small changes to this hand to make it look more like an old photograph. But let's be smart about this, literally, by making this layer a smart layer. I'm going to come to the Filter drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose Convert for Smart Filters. I say OK. This layer has now been turned into a smart object. This allows us to do a number of things to this image using smart filters that we can edit later on. The first thing I'm going to do is come to the bottom of my Layers panel, and from my Adjustment Layers options, I'm going to choose my Levels adjustments. Here I can change the light and darkness values of my image. For a collage animation like this, I'm going to increase my contrast by dragging my levels sliders a little bit closer to the center. My highlights are a little bit brighter, and my shadows are a little bit darker. Currently, this levels adjustment is being applied to all the layers underneath it. But we can be selective about how we apply these adjustment layers so that it only affects the immediate layer below it by doing this simple trick. I'm going to take my cursor and position it between my adjustment layer and the layer below it. If I press the Option button on my keyboard, you can see that that icon now turns into a downward arrow. If I click on the line in between those two layers, that will now create an adjustment layer that only affects the layer directly beneath it, leaving the other layer unaffected. I'm going to turn that layer back off. Let's choose another adjustment layer. I could choose black and white and take out the color from that layer, making this a black and white photograph that I'm working with. However, I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to go Command Z. Instead of a black and white adjustment layer, I'm going to choose Gradient Map. This is one of my favorite adjustments to make. The Gradient Map, as the name suggests, maps a color across the light and dark pixels of our image. What I'm hoping to do is create something that looked a bit more like a sepia tone photograph. To do that, I'm going to click once inside of this gradient in our properties panel right here. And you can see that our gradient editor opens up. I'm going to change the color of this gradient down here by clicking on the first of the color stops on the left, the black one. By clicking on that, I open up this color swatch here. I'm going to click on that, and from this color picker pop-up, I'm going to choose a dark orange brown for my first color stop. I'm going to say OK. I'm now going to click on the second of our color stops here, the white one. Again, clicking on this color swatch, I'm going to choose a neutralized yellow-orange. And you can see how this color gradient is now applied to the light and dark pixels of my original image. Now, you don't have to use this particular color setup. As I mentioned, I was hoping to achieve something that looked like an old-fashioned sepia tone photograph. I'm going to say OK. And OK one more time. And I now have two adjustment layers applied to this hand. There are still a couple of other things that I'd like to do in order to make this image feel a bit more antique. The first thing I'm going to do is choose this hand layer, and I'm going to come to the filter drop-down menu, and I'm going to add a little bit of noise, making our image look just a little bit more distressed. I'm going to recommend that you keep the values down to something under 10. I'm going to say OK. There is another thing that we could do to make this image look like it was perhaps taken from a newspaper by adding a halftone dot effect. However, let me just caution you here that the halftone dot effect doesn't always work in animation. The dots can sometimes feel a little bit too small. Again, with this layer 1 selected, I'm going to come to the filter drop-down menu, and I'm going to select Pixelate Color Halftone. I'm going to make this the smallest value I can, which happens to be 4. Now, these values for channels 1, 2, 3, and 4 represent the screen angles of traditional CMYK offset printing. But I want this to look like it was printed in a newspaper, so I don't actually want all these CMYK colors. In order to achieve a newspaper look, I just need to make all of these values the same. In this case, I've made them all 45, and I'm going to say OK. Now you can see how that has created what looks like traditional offset printing halftone dots. I'll let you decide if you want to maintain that effect or not. But because we've turned this into a smart layer, I can turn that effect on and off at any time. In fact, I'm going to leave this off because I think it looks better like this. I'm going to zoom back in so I can see this. The next thing I need to do is create the torn paper edge effect that we see in the animation. But that requires a number of steps in order to achieve, which could really increase the amount of time that this project is going to take. However, let's use Photoshop's Actions panel in order to record all these next steps so we can apply easily this torn paper edge effect to all the remaining hands with a simple click of a button. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing I need to do is create a new layer underneath this currently selected layer that's going to contain the torn paper edge. I'm going to come to the bottom of my layers panel and click on this plus button. This has created a new layer above my layer 1. However, I need this layer to be below layer 1. So here I'm just going to drag it down below like that. The next thing I need to do is make a selection from this layer 1 hand. The easiest way to do that is to take my cursor, place it over top of the layer preview, and while pressing the command button on my keyboard, click once. I still have layer 2 selected. Everything we do from here on will be applied to layer 2. Now what we're going to do is create a torn paper edge effect. But this is going to take a number of steps. If we had to redo these steps every time for each one of these hands, this is going to be a long exercise. However, we are going to take advantage of Photoshop's Actions panel that allows us to record our steps and then apply them later with a single button click. To do that, I'm going to come over to my Actions panel. If you don't see your Actions panel in your panel stack, come to the Window drop-down menu and choose Actions. Once you open up your Actions panel, to keep ourselves organized, let's create a new action set by clicking on this little folder icon at the bottom of our Actions panel. And I'm going to call this new set Torn Paper Edge. And that has created a new empty folder. Let's put something in that folder by coming again to the bottom of our Actions panel, and this time choosing this plus button, which is going to create a new action. Again, I'm going to call this action Torn Paper Edge. You can see that there's no OK button. We now have a record button, meaning that everything that we do from here on out is going to be recorded by Photoshop. I'm going to press record. Everything I'm doing from here on out is going to be a part of our Torn Paper Edge action. I can now close this. The first thing I'm going to do is come here to Select and Mask. We're going to make some slight changes to our selection. I now have a black and white view of my selection, and I'm going to do a couple of things. The first is bring my smooth slider up just a little bit. It basically rounds the edges of my selection. This could be fine at a 100%, but I'm going to actually put my smooth slider to about 50% right there. The next thing I'm going to do, though, is bring my contrast slider all the way to the right. If I zoom in, you can see that this becomes something much more hard-edged. This is necessary to make our torn paper edge not look like it's transparent. I find bringing this contrast slider to anything above 50 okay for our purposes, and I'm going to say okay. Now I'm going to zoom out. We now know that we have a much sharper edged selection than we had earlier. The next thing I'm going to do is expand our selection edge by roughly 10 pixels. I'm going to come to the Select drop-down menu and choose Modify, Expand. For our purposes, 10 pixels will work just fine. I'm going to say OK. The next step is to come over to our toolbox on the left and click on this Edit in Quick Mask mode and click once. So now that I'm in Quick Mask mode, I'm now going to come to my Filter drop-down menu, choose my Filter Gallery. I'm going to reveal the Brush Strokes options, and I'm going to choose this option, Splatter. And I'm going to set my spray radius to 8 and smoothness value to 11. With those values, if I zoom in to my image, you can see what that has done to my edge. And now I'm going to say OK. It's kind of hard to see, but that splatter effect has now been applied to this light pink selection. I'm now going to exit Quick Mask mode by coming back to this Quick Mask button and turning that off. The final step for this effect is to actually fill this selection with white. I'm going to do that by coming to the Edit drop-down menu and selecting Fill and choosing Contents White from this drop-down menu. And I'm going to say OK. I can now stop this action by coming to my Actions panel, and I'm going to press the Stop button because our action is now complete. And you can see here in our Torn Paper Edge set, all the steps that we've just completed have been recorded here. I'll show you how we apply them to the next hand in just a moment. The effect itself is a little bit hard to see because of the transparent checkered background. If you really want to see how this is working, I'm going to create another layer and put that behind that white layer. I can now fill that new layer with black. So there is our torn paper edge. However, I do have a bit of an issue with how uniform it is around the entire edge of my hand. I'd like to make some small changes to that so that it doesn't feel quite so uniform. There's a couple different ways I can do this. I'm going to choose this layer that I've just created. I'm going to come over to the Edit drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose Free Transform, or Command T on my keyboard. And you can see now that I have this bounding box around this layer. I could use this bounding box to resize that white layer, but that's not really what I'm looking for. What I'm going to do is choose this option right here, which allows me to enter into free warp mode. And with that free warp mode selected, I can now click within my white layer and start making some subtle adjustments so that it doesn't feel completely uniform. I find some areas will be a little bit thicker and some will be a little bit thinner. Once you have it looking the way you'd like, just press return or the check mark, and I now have the torn paper edge look that I was looking for. I'm going to zoom out. So I'm going to turn the other hands back on. I'm going to do this same effect to this hand. Just let me show you just how easily I can do it. Again, I'm going to choose this layer, choose my quick selection tool. I'm going to go over top of my hand. I'm going to create a new layer via cut, Command-Shift-J on my keyboard. It might be easier to see this if I drag this layer above my newly created black background layer so I can see it this way. I want this layer to be a smart object like the first hand was, so I'm going to come to the filter drop-down menu and choose convert for smart filters. And select OK. It is now a smart object, as you can see by the icon in the corner of that layer preview window. Now I want this layer to have all the same effects as this previous layer. I can do that easily by choosing my gradient map layer, this one right here, and by holding the Option button on a Mac or Alt on a PC, dragging this layer above my newly created second hand. You can see by the color shift, though, that this adjustment layer is being applied not only to this layer, but all the layers below it. I want to limit the effect of this adjustment layer to only this layer below it. Remember, I just have to take my cursor and hover in between those two layers, holding down my Option button and clicking once. I also want to add these smart filter effects to this layer. Again, we can do that by holding down the Option button and clicking on the Add Noise effect and dragging it over top of layer 4. I now have the smart filters from the previous layer applied to this layer. The next thing, though, is to add that torn paper edge. I'm going to choose this new layer that we just created. I'm going to make a selection from that layer by holding down my Command button and clicking on this layer's preview window and loading a selection like that. The next step is to create a layer that this white torn paper edge effect is going to exist on. Remember, it's not going to be this layer. We don't want to change that. So again, I'm going to come to the bottom of my layers panel and click the plus button down here to create a new layer. The final step is to bring this layer below the layer that I'm currently want to create that effect for. Okay, here is where having made that previous torn paper edge action is going to really pay off. I'm going to open up my actions panel and I'm going to choose my torn paper edge effect, not the folder, but the torn paper edge action right here. And in order to apply it, I just need to come to the bottom of my actions panel and choose play selection. Photoshop will do some work in the background. And there you go. That has saved us a bit of time. But remember, I want this edge not to look quite so uniform, so I'm going to make sure that I have this layer selected, and I'm going to choose from the Edit drop-down menu, Free Transform, or Command-T on my keyboard. I'm going to choose the Warp effect, and I'm going to just subtly try to create some variation in the width of that torn paper edge. And there we go. I'm going to press my check mark or return on my keyboard, and I now have my torn paper edge effect. Now, there are still some things we can do to this image to make it look a bit more like a rustic old photograph, including some texture masking. I'll let you decide if you want to add that as well. So I've jumped ahead here and I've completed the remaining hands. And as you can see in my layers panel, I have the hands on their own individual layers and the torn paper edge layers underneath each of them with the Add Noise Smart filter on each, as well as the gradient map layer above each of those hands. What I want to do now is prepare this file for import into After Effects. Remember, After Effects can recognize individual layers of a Photoshop file, meaning that if we were to import this file as is into After Effects, each one of these layers becomes its own individual layer in After Effects. That would become problematic as we proceed with this exercise. So the last thing we're going to do is combine these separate layers into one single layer. Let me show you how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to, first of all, select the first of my gradient map layers. And while holding the Shift button, I'm going to select the layer directly below that. And again, still holding the Shift button, select the layer below the hand. I now have all the layers selected for hand on the left. I'm going to combine all these layers together by coming to the Layer drop-down menu and choose Merge Layers, or Command E on my keyboard. And you can see that I now have this layer. It's taken on the name of the topmost layer, which was my gradient map layer. So let's change the name of that now. I'm going to just double click on the name, and I'm just going to type in 1. I'm going to press return, and I now have all those layers combined into one layer. I'm going to do the same for the next layer down. Select those 3 layers, come to the layer drop-down menu, and choose Merge Layers, Command E. Double click, I'm going to call that 2. Command E, double click, 3. 1, 2, 3. Command E, double click, 4. And finally, Command E, double click, we'll call that 5. I still have this levels adjustment layer above all of these. As I was working on this, I didn't really need to have the levels adjustment for each one of these layers. It's sometimes nice to have, but I didn't actually duplicate that one. So I'm actually going to turn that off. I won't proceed with that. If I need to, I can always add some levels adjustments later in After Effects. So I have a file that is ready for exporting to After Effects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my File drop-down menu and select Save As. I'm saving my exercise file in a folder called Hands. Wherever you are saving your exercise files, I'm going to suggest that you rename this to something else. I'm going to call mine for Export. I'm going to make sure that's still a Photoshop file, and that's all I need to do. Click Save. We are now ready to proceed with the rest of this exercise.